Happy Monday and welcome back to U.S. History. It is I, your fearless leader, Mr. Fuqua, and we're going to pick up with Roman numeral 2 today, prosperity and materialism, which in your textbook is on page 416. All right, so prosperity and materialism. Prosperity meaning having success, and materialism meaning where you put a lot of value on material goods. And the Roaring Twenties is all about prosperity and materialism. But let's go ahead and talk about some things in this section today about what revolutionized America, whether it be an industry or whether it be even financially or concerning technology. So let's go ahead and look, starting with capital A, technological advances. And so it says, number one, the automobile. The automobile had been invented well before the 1920s. However, there were only a few families per area that really had an automobile. They were extremely expensive until a man by the name of Henry Ford came along in 1903 and began building what he called the Model T, the Ford Model T. And Henry Ford was an interesting character. He wanted to make a vehicle that was easily accessible and easily bought by just average Americans, not just the wealthy. And so he began making his Model T car in 1903, and many families were then able to start purchasing cars, especially after World War I, when production of the Model T ramped up. Henry Ford, interesting character, like I've mentioned earlier. One of my favorite stories is that people were asking him, Henry, they said, when are you going to make a Model T that's not just the color black? Because the only Model Ts he was putting out was in the color black. And he said, hey, the Americans can have any color Model T they want, just as long as it's black. And so it was kind of a blunt answer and sarcastic answer saying, I'm never going to make another Model T a different color. It's just going to be black, and if you don't like it, you can just put up with it. So the cars, though, it made travel easy for Americans, especially Americans that were living out in rural regions. They were now able to travel as a family into the city or to meet people. That they're not just stuck in isolation anymore. They can get out, and it's faster to get from point A to point B than on horseback or by walking. If you go ahead and look on page 417, I can pull it up here for you. Here's a picture of the Model T right here, of course, in the color black. But let's look at production and prices of the Model T. And the purpose of the Model T, if you remember, like I just said, was that average Americans could afford the Model T. And so we see here with this blue line on the chart, this line graph, okay, that's the price. And then, of course, the dotted line is production, how many they're producing. And so we see that as production increases, the price decreases. And I said after 1917, that's whenever we begin to see a lot more production in the production of Model Ts. And so while the production increases, notice that the price, it gradually decreases over time from where it began. And so the Model T was an inexpensive car that average Americans could have. The second advance concerning inventions would be the airplane. In 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright, what many historians generally agree to be the first successful flight, that's when that took place. But it wasn't until the 1920s, whenever the airplane was really put on the map concerning a form of travel. Now, we didn't have commercial airlines in the 1920s. However, there was a man by the name of Charles Lindbergh that said, I'm going to fly from New York to France in just one flight, a non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And so he was the first man, Charles Lindbergh, to make the first non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. It took him about 33 hours, I believe it says in your textbook, on page 418, 33 and a half hours to get from New York to Paris. And he flew in his plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. Tragic story, though, about Charles Lindbergh. He was an instant hero, an instant celebrity because of this nonstop flight. But later in his life, one of his babies, it was about 20 months old, his son was kidnapped from the nursery room in their home. And there was a note, a ransom note for $50,000. And so they tried to find the baby. They couldn't. They tried to negotiate with his kidnapper, but the searches stopped whenever they found a dead baby not too far from their home. So tragic story involving Charles Lindbergh and his 20-month-old son. Many people call it the crime of the century. But that's one thing that's associated with Charles Lindbergh. But the good thing about Charles Lindbergh was that he had the first nonstop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And that brings us to electric wonders. So by 1929, we have inventors that are applying electricity to normal household appliances like a refrigerator, the icebox, the stove, the iron, washing machine. Now they were starting to make the transition from archaic versions of themselves to electric versions, stuff that we enjoy today. We also see the invention of the radio, allowing wireless transmission of sound and communication. And this was the basis of the radio. Was invented by a man named Guglielmo Marconi. And it wasn't long after that Americans began trying to perfect the radio. You have cities that create these radio stations, and the first commercial broadcast in the United States was announcing that Warren G. Harding had won the presidential election. And that was in 1920, November 2nd, 1920. Also, what the radio did was it allowed for Americans to be entertained. They were able to sit in their homes in the evening or at nighttime and listen to shows, much like we do today with TV. They were able to do this with radio. So there was no visual entertainment at the time, but it was sitting down in the living room and listening to music, listening to radio shows, listening to entertainment shows, and things of that nature. But also, and most importantly, it provided a way to make announcements or to transmit news over the radio instead of people having to wait to the next day to get a newspaper. Now they're listening to their show, hold up, breaking news, and then they would hear breaking news over the radio instead of having to wait to read it in the paper the next day. So now news is being transmitted at a faster rate than just on paper. Now it's being transmitted over the radio waves. We also see a business boom during this time. This is on page 419, a business boom. What we see here is that now there are certain industries that began using different methods of producing their items. And Henry Ford really perfected this with the creation of what we call the assembly line. The assembly line is still used today. The assembly line was where there would be people in a certain part of the factory that would work on a specific portion. Let's use the Model T as an example. So some people being specifically focused on the axle of the car, while others are focused specifically on fusing the doors together. And so you have this line where the car is consistently being put together, and it gets more and more complete as it goes down the line with people working on different parts of the car. Production moves faster that way. And so what they're able to do here is produce more cars at a faster rate. We can see the assembly line here, mass production of the Model T. You see how it's on this track as it moves down and people working on specific parts of the car. And that is what we call the assembly line. All right, interesting fact. It says Henry Ford created this assembly line, which allowed him to build a new car every 27 seconds. That's crazy. That's why we saw the production, if we look at that picture. That's why we see production skyrocket in the 1920s, because he's able to put out a new car every 27 seconds. All right, so that is going to do it for our lecture today, Prosperity and Materialism. Just a couple of announcements. So your homework, and this is Monday's lecture, lecture 7. So tonight you need to read pages 420 to 423. Now you need to stop whenever you reach the section entitled Response to Decline in Morality. And let's see here. So on page 423, responses to declining morality, you need to stop at that point. And then you need to complete and submit the reading assessment number 3, which is on Google Classroom. You also will have a quiz on Wednesday, which will cover lectures 6 through 8. So make sure that you study your notes for the quiz on Wednesday. All right, now I do want to go over our poll question, which was, if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you have? And so I'm going to go by sections here. We have first period, invisibility. This is a pretty good one. Sleep with my eyes open. Another one, invisibility, invincibility. And then someone put invincibility, but they switched it to invisibility. And then another said teleportation. Very interesting. Moving on to second period. Let's see here. And I'm going to try to find it. Okay, here we go. I would most likely want to control darkness, light, fire, and wind. So be an avatar, basically. Teleportation or super speed. I would like to have wheels instead of legs so I can zoom around. Interesting. Telekinesis. The ability to manipulate water. Shape-shifting or mind reading. One person said mind reading. Super speed or invisibility. The ability to teleport. Another person said be invisible. A lot of people want to be invisible. My wife would love to be invisible so that she could spy on her neighbors and not be caught. She's always peering through the blinds, looking at our neighbors. All right, let's see here. Be able to remember or forget anything of my choosing forever. That's really deep. Invisibility or photographic memory. I want to be able to fly. I would want to have invisibility. Super fast reflexes. Like the whoa. Time control. Flying so I could fly around. That's what you do when you are able to fly. I would want to fly because I can't drive for a while. One person, this is 7th period, so I think everyone might know who this is. Become smart boy. Interesting. Telekinesis, so I could get things without having to move. To be able to do math, that is a superpower that many people would love to have. Shapeshift, be able to dunk, and to be able to freeze time. So very interesting answers. I will come up with the next poll question as soon as I can. I hope that y'all have a great rest of your Monday, and I will see you on Tuesday.